what philosophy is in the Christian context, namely the handmaid to theology, an entirely independent standing discipline, but one which, in a Christian context, is ordered to the same thing that theology is, namely to bring us into greater knowledge of God through knowing the world that He has created. And so philosophy, like theology, orders us to God and helps us to attain happiness.
Thank you very much, Father Peter, and to all colleagues and friends, new friends and old friends at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. As Father Peter said, I've been working for the past few years on an initiative housed at the Vatican called Ethics in Action for Sustainable and Integral Human Development, which really, the goal of that is to bring together people from all kinds of traditions, different religious traditions, also philosophers, economists, activists, all kinds of people, to basically form an ethical consensus on some of these major issues and then try and turn that into action in terms of what the world needs to do. Because one of the main messages I would like to give you all today is that we really need action right now, because we're in a very, very difficult position, difficult state in the global economy. And if we don't move now, the 21st century is not going to look very pleasant for our children and grandchildren. I'm sorry to start on a downer message, but I'll try and cheer you up a little bit. But we are inspired very much by Laudato Si, the encyclical of Pope Francis. And as you know, Laudato Si is the latest encyclical in a long stream of Catholic social teaching documents that most people trace to Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum in 1891, wasn't it? 1891. And in fact, the argument I would probably like to make to you this morning is that, in my view, Laudato Si is probably the most important encyclical since Rerum Novarum in that long line. And I think I'll start by, that's the context I want to put it in. Let me say that. Maybe I'll just start with a funny story before I start. So when I told Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, was the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences, that I was had the great honor of being a fellow at the DSPT, he said to me, "Congratulations, but you need to tell them all that Catholic social teaching is nothing more than the application of St. Thomas to modern problems, and that's all it is." So there you go. So huge endorsement for the Dominicans coming there. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Why was Rerum Novarum so important? Rerum Novarum was so important because it really talked about the new things of the Industrial Revolution, the huge social and economic upheavals brought about by unprecedented economic changes. And, as we all know, Pope Leo talked about the injustices, the inequalities, the disgraceful exploitation of labor by the owners of capital who didn't seem to be bound by any moral responsibility. And again, this was a very new development. It took the church a long time to figure out they needed to speak on this. But when they spoke in a very, very strong voice. Now, so I would argue that that's late 19th century. That was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We're kind of seeing, the major shift from the countryside to the cities, away from agriculture towards industry, the explosion of the use of fossil fuels to propel economic growth and living standards. That's when it all began. Now fast forward to today, 2018 or 2015, when Laudato Si was written. So we are kind of at the tail end of that enormous economic explosion. And what Pope Francis is doing in Laudato Si is reevaluating the Industrial Revolution, as it were, and saying that what Pope Leo saw in his time was an accurate reflection of his sign of the times. Pope Francis is doing exactly the same, reading the sign of the times today, and they are very, very different, right? Because the state of industrialization in the world today looks very different than it did in the late 19th century. we're basically saying the new things of today really relate to the impact of human activity on the planet and the people who live in it. Now, just think about how this took place. Before the Industrial Revolution, for hundreds if not thousands of years, there was really no economic growth or population growth. If you look at the charts of economic growth, it's just flat, century after century after century. Some little movements up and down, you had the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, the Black Death in the 14th century were downs, there's some increases in productivity, but really on the long line of things, these are little blips. What happens around 1750 is it goes like this. It starts to go up, the level of economic activity, and that's the Industrial Revolution. And that's the kind of the unprecedented transformation that Pope Leo was really, really talking about. Before then, there was really no economic growth because, as John Maynard Keynes says, there was no technological progress and no capital accumulation. It was long centuries of flat economic and population growth. But then after 1750, we started to see wave upon wave. And one wave tends to build on the next. It's a dynamic process. It started with the mechanization of textiles, steam engines, railways, steamships, electricity, automobiles, petrochemicals, aviation, information and communication technology. Now, if you think about that, you will see a very linear progression from one industrial revolution to the next. And of course, it's not ended. There's the whole IT revolution and robotics and 3D printing and all that kind of stuff. So this technological progress is ongoing. This, of course, led to a huge spike in economic activity and in living standards. I'm not sure most people realize, but the vast bulk of that actually took place after the Second World War. It's fairly recent. So it started in England in the mid-18th century, spread out to Europe, to the US, and gradually, more and more countries were able to take advantage of this. But now, the big jump was after the Second World War, and now since the Industrial Revolution, the world GDP, world output, is over 200 times larger than it was back then. And the world population is up ninefold to about 7 billion people. And it's not slowing down. By mid-century, we expect the global economy to increase threefold all over again. As more and more people, and this is a very interesting issue because, this new growth is from the developing and low-income countries. And we want them to benefit from what we benefited from, right? It's a real ethical issue to say, well, I'm sorry, the party's over. We enjoyed the party, but you don't get to enjoy the party. That's an issue, by the way, that countries like India and China get very annoyed by, for obvious reasons. So this is a big ethical issue. How do we handle it? What it means is we're bumping up against what the scientists call the planetary boundaries, which means we are disrupting some of the Earth's core cycles of biology, chemistry, and geology. And we're leaving behind what we call the safe operating space of the Holocene. The Holocene is the 10,000-year period of really remarkable climatic stability, which allowed human civilization to develop. And many of us in this room would argue that there was some divine providence involved in that, because if you look at the Holocene, it's a very remarkable period of stability. But now we're moving out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene, which is the first geologic period where we, human beings, are actually making it. It's not the natural cycles of the planet. We are interfering with it and we are causing changes. What kinds of changes? We don't know, because we've never been there before. We know the Holocene, we understand how it works, we understand the mechanisms and the stability inherent in it. The Anthropocene is a whole new world. So we're hitting, these boundaries we're hitting, the biggest one, of course, is climate change. But there are others. There's the acidification of the oceans, the overuse and shortage of freshwater resources, land use changes, especially deforestation of the great lungs of the planet in the Amazon and in tropical forests in Africa and the Indonesian archipelago. And there's the pollution caused by the interference with the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles from overuse of fertilizers. There's ozone depletion, there's chemical pollution, there's airborne pollution from burning fossil fuels. Just go to Beijing or New Delhi in the winter and you'll see the effects of that very, very clearly. And of course, there's the rapid loss of biodiversity which has all kinds of very bad feedback mechanisms to the quality of human life on the planet. So when Pope Francis says, "Never have we so hurt and mistreated our common home as we have in the last 200 years, he's really talking about this industrial revolution and what it's doing. And he actually, the issues I talked about, pollution, climate change, deforestation, ocean acidification, water use, loss of biodiversity, Pope Francis touches on each of these topics in the first chapter of Laudato Si. It's a very, the scientists who read this will all affirm that he actually gets it right. This is actually a cutting-edge scientific analysis. I know ecologists have said they would be happy to assign this text to their students because it's actually correct. It's very up, and this is what I mean. So in Pope Leo's day, we didn't have any of this. You know, the effects on the environment were very limited and localized. So Pope Leo wasn't aware of this. You know, Pope Paul VI wasn't aware of this. Even Pope John Paul was only vaguely aware of this. He did talk about, you know, the pending ecological crisis, but it's only really become aware how drastic it is in the last decade or so, or 10, 15 years. And I think this is why Laudato Si is such an important and prescient document. Now, the other issue, of course, to mention here is that not only, you know, and we all know we can probably, other speakers will probably talk about the effects of climate change in particular, which is probably the largest, the most important, and the most dangerous of the planetary boundaries we're traversing. And just so you know, as of today, global temperatures have probably increased by about 2 degrees Celsius, 1.2 degrees Celsius since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The Paris Treaty on climate change says we have to cap that at 2 degrees Celsius. But you've got to remember there's so much temperature increase already built in from the burning of fossil fuels, from the warming of the oceans, that there's a very limited, it's like this huge big ship that you're trying to change directions. You can't just change directions. It takes a very, very long time to do it. There's so much momentum already built in. And I'll talk a little later about what that means if we really want to cap it at 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees does not mean safety, by the way. 2 degrees has devastating effects, especially on the world's poorest people. But if we keep as we're going, we're not talking about 2 degrees, we're talking 4 to 6 degrees, which is really game over for the quality of life, especially for the poor. This is why I think that this is probably one of the most important, pressing moral problems of the 21st century, which none of us are really grappling with the full implications of it for various psychological reasons. We don't want to deal. We try to push these things out of our mind. Temporal reasons. Well, it's not happening tomorrow, so let's not think about it today. And there are various political reasons which Pope Francis talks about, which I'll mention later. Of course, the other issue is Pope Francis is not just talking about the environment, he's also talking about the quality of human relationships. And as we know, this massive fossil fuel, technology-driven global behemoth of a global economy, as it reaches more and more countries, it unites all these countries in a globalization through trade, through financial flows, through migration, through culture. And as we know, this is, this is why this is a very prescient time, because, it's now dawned on people that this globalization is not the happy part of the big happy part that we all thought it would be. We economists in the 90s all thought globalization was going to be great. It would raise living standards for everybody. And let's be honest, globalization has really benefited countries like India and China. But the problem is there are major, major side effects. One of them being massive rises in inequality within countries, including in the US, including in Europe, as the winners of globalization tend to be financial elites and large corporations, and the losers of globalization tend to be workers who, from traditional manufacturing industries, who no longer have any prospects, having their communities devastated, and we all know that massive social dysfunction this is causing. We know in both sides of the Atlantic that this leads to a loss of, an undermining of institutions and social norms, shift towards extremism on both right and left. So, we're really living in a very, very precarious global situation. And I think that one way to think of the ethical and moral dilemma and the way out of this is to analyze what Pope Francis was trying to teach us in Laudato Si, and how sustainable development is really the correct response to a lot of these, both in economic and environmental problems. Now, let me talk about this diagnosis. I'm keeping my eye on the time. I tend to talk too much. I'm sorry. And Pope Francis' diagnosis is really the idea of integral ecology. I won't spend much time on that, because I know other speakers are going to talk about that about the theology of it, and I'm no expert in that, so I won't. The idea that, where everything is connected. The term "everything is connected" is probably the phrase that comes up most often in Laudato Si. The idea that we human beings and nature are deeply interconnected and inseparable and part of a larger whole. And he talks about that human life is defined by the three relationships: to God, to our fellow human beings, and to the earth. And when you break one of those relationships, you break the other relationships too. I think from theologically, I think is Pope Francis' the point he's trying to make here, this connectedness. But why is this? Why are we in this situation? I think Pope Francis' main diagnosis is what he calls the technocratic paradigm, which I think is a very powerful tool to analyze this. The technocratic paradigm is the simple idea that human beings can and should achieve mastery over the earth and its resources in the name of unlimited economic progress. This is the logic of possession, mastery, and transformation. The earth is just stuff you can use and manipulate for your own benefit. This disconnects, of course, human activity from big questions of ends and purposes, the questions which taxed philosophers from Aristotle through Aquinas through the present day. And we throw all that out, because economic activity only matters in terms of utility, productivity, or efficiency. Questions of value, or of dignity, or of worth, or of purpose, we don't worry about. We just bracket them. It's not an issue. And of course, what that means is it becomes inevitable that the global economy is then driven by power in pursuit of profit. Power being political, economic, and technological power in pursuit of profit. I think his argument is because once you bracket the moral questions, you're left with nothing else. Your only purpose becomes make as much money as possible in any way you can. And that, of course, constricts the ethical horizon and disconnects freedom from moral responsibility. As Pope Francis says, immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. What that means, he says, it leads to what he terms practical relativism. The idea that everything is irrelevant unless it serves my immediate self-interest. You treat people and the earth as simply things to be taken advantage of. The words he uses over and over again are self-centeredness, self-absorption, a self-centered culture of instant gratification. Self, 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 self. This is the real problem that's being brought to the fore here. And how this manifests, he lists how this is manifesting itself. Forced labor, modern slavery, abortion, sexual exploitation of children, abandonment of the elderly, sale of organs, crime, drugs, commerce in blood, diamonds, and endangered species. All of these infamies, which I think all of us in this room would say, these are infamies. But the interesting thing is, he adds to this list the disordered desire to consume more than is necessary and putting your faith in the invisible forces of the market. Now, this is a challenge to many people, say in the US in particular, who are used to thinking that the market is actually a form of liberation and economic freedom is something we should value. But Pope Francis is saying, be very, very careful, because this diagnosis I am making here, one of the ways it manifests itself is in the belief that the market can be used in this way, to use it this way, devoid of any ethical content, driven purely by power in pursuit of profit. Of course, what this leads to is the throwaway culture. I think this is Pope Francis' signature diagnosis. That, you use people and things to satisfy your own gratifications, and then you just throw them away. You discard them when they're of no further use. This is the economy of exclusion. The excluded, he says, They're not even part of society. And not just at the bottom rung of the ladder. They're not on the ladder at all. They're just leftovers, outcasts, collateral damage. It brings to mind the quote from Gustavo Gutierrez, who once said, the poor don't even have the right to have rights. They're so out there. They're so excluded. And the bottom line, he said, and in one of his I think one of Pope Francis' most powerful speeches after Laudato Si was a speech he gave in Bolivia, I think it was, or was it Ecuador? I think it was Bolivia, where he said, let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality where money rules rather than serves. That economy kills, that economy excludes, that economy destroys Mother Earth. And I remember there was a popular, this was at the meeting of the popular movements in Bolivia. There was a meeting of the popular movements, I believe, last year in California, on the initiative of Pope Francis, and I think Bishop McElroy of San Diego actually used this quote, and he said, I want you to name people that you know who have been killed by this economy. And it was a very powerful moment. People started shouting out names, and then Bishop McElroy says, let us mourn them and pray for them. Very, very powerful moment of really putting the teaching of Pope Francis into action. Now, again, where does this all come from? And this is where I want to take a little detour into some of my own ideas, which would be familiar to some of you all here. Because what Pope Francis says, he said it's about the myths of modernity grounded in the utilitarian mindset. He says individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, and the unregulated market. So when I read that, I was thinking the myths of modernity, it really brings to mind, I think, the wrong turn that took place with during the Enlightenment. Now, when I say this to some audiences, people started looking at me thinking of some kind of hideous reactionary. And I'm like, no, we're not throwing out universal human rights, people. But I do believe that with the Enlightenment, we did lose the idea of the common good at the expense of the elevation of the individual, the self, and the use of science to gain knowledge and control of nature and improve human life. Now, using science to improve human life is a good, noble aim, but when it's divorced from responsibility, and when you have lost the idea of the common good, then you're in a whole heap of trouble. And I think, in my view anyway, that's where a lot of things went wrong. And if you see the dominant paradigm today, I think we need to get past this. We get trapped in this right versus left, liberal, conservative, blah, blah, blah. I think, let's get past that because, both sides really have the same philosophical root, which is, the individual comes before the common good, and we should not presuppose any conception of the good life. It's up to you to choose your own good. And one side of politics likes to focus on, issues of life and sexuality. The other side likes to focus on economics and, material stuff. It's the same mentality. It's the same libertarian mentality as far as I'm concerned. That, we've lost the idea of the common good, which is really the idea of solidarity, that we're all responsible for all, and that includes future generations, and that includes all of creation, in fact. It's not just about, and this is where I think my discipline of economics really lost its way, because economics became about the maximum extension of individual choices with no conception of a common good whatsoever. Neoclassical economics says every individual simply maximizes their subjective material preferences on the market. That's all they do. Right? Some of you who are economists, you know this. But if you break that down, it's assumed we're all egoists. Me. It's assumed that all we care about is material things, what I can buy in the market. Relationships, the idea of meaning and purpose, religion, nature, don't think about things like that. And it's subjective, that's the key word. Or, pretty much I would say nearly every ethical tradition is based on, how do I move from how I am now to how I should be? How do I self-improve? But economics says, no, we don't worry about that. Your subjectives, our preferences are what they are. We don't judge you. You maximize your preferences. So this is a kind of, my economists don't like me saying this, but this is a kind of a very, very weird way of approaching an ethical paradigm. And I think it leads us to a really bad dead end. Now, Pope Francis doesn't talk about any of this explicitly in Laudato Si, but if you read between the lines, I think this is a lot of what he's talking about, that economics has really taken a wrong turn. And he does say that, the problem is not the market. I mean, markets are simply just ways to, bring people together to cooperate for mutual gain. No wrong with the market. The problem is when you have the ideological overlay, what he calls the deified market, or the magical conception of the market. And he said, his argument is that when that happens, we become numb to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. He says, we are incapable of feeling compassion for the outcry of the poor. The culture of prosperity deadens us. It's a very powerful quote. We get so caught up in this world which economists and politicians and scientists and all the people are telling us, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is what the purpose of your life. This is how you should be living. But I think, deep down, we know, I think, at a very basic level, that there's something really wrong with living this way. Disconnected from relationship, disconnected from a higher purpose, and a common good. So I think the solution that Pope Francis calls for is, he calls it a new kind of progress. Don't abandon progress, a new kind of progress. One that is healthier, more human, more social, and more integral. And that's a very lovely quote, I think. He calls for integral and sustainable human development. Now we know, as Catholics, what integral human development means from Pope Paul VI, the idea, the good of the whole person and every person. So let everybody flourish across all dimensions. It's a very Aristotelian idea. And Pope Francis really manifests that when he talks about the importance of work and the importance of decent work, so that people can find meaning, a destiny, and live with dignity. There's a whole section in Laudato Si on employment and work, which might surprise some people who think that it's about climate change and biodiversity, but this is essential, very essential for Pope Francis. And of course, the sustainable part comes from the sustainable development, which is the area I've been working in. And to quote Pope Francis, we need an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. This is the sustainable development agenda, the idea that if you can no longer judge progress on the economic dimension alone. Economic growth alone is not going to cut it. It has to go hand in hand with social inclusion, and it has to go hand in hand with environmental sustainability, with protecting the planet. Now, in 2015, 193 countries in the world endorsed what's called the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These sustainable development goals, maybe I should have put them up just for you're not familiar with them. There are things like end extreme poverty by 2030. Make sure everybody has access to basic health care. Everybody has access to universal secondary education in every country of the world. Everybody has access to nutrition, to water, to sanitation, to clean energy, right? We focus on decent work. We focus on reducing inequalities. We focus on eradicating climate change, biodiversity, making consumption and production more sustainable, improving agricultural productivity within a green way, right? All of this is all sustainable development. Now, every country in the world has endorsed these, so in my view, this is not law. There's no law of the SDGs. You can't sue a country for violating them. But every country has endorsed them, and in my view, promises should mean something. Your word is your bond, right? But I think a lot of countries are not really paying enough attention to these important sustainable development goals. Laudato Si was timed very specifically. When Pope Francis decided to write this encyclical, I think it was in 2014. So the people in the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace were obviously very excited about this, and I think they rushed to get him a draft. If I remember correctly, they gave up their summer vacation so they could get him a draft by September, expecting this to be out by the end of 2014. It wasn't out, as you know, until June 2015. Was it May or June? June 2015. Now, that's not because Pope Francis was just a very slow editor. he wanted to influence what was going on in 2015, which was one, the Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations, and he came in September and he opened the special session at the UN where the countries endorsed the Sustainable Development Goals and talked about the importance of this. An incredibly powerful moment for all of us, a very proud moment for me as a Catholic to be able to see that. And then, a few months later in December, the same countries in the world endorsed the Paris Agreement on climate change, where for the first time they all agreed that they would take action to move to a fully decarbonized economy. No more oil, no more gas, no more coal by the second half of the 21st century. Realistically, the scientists say if you want to meet your goals on climate, you have to be pretty much there by 2050, decarbonized. That's only 3 decades away. That's an unbelievably profound implication to just completely transform our energy system in 3 decades. It's unprecedented, but it's what we've agreed to, and it's what it's going to take. And this is why I said at the beginning that this was so hard. Now, on the positive side, when all the countries endorsed this, delegation after delegation mentioned Laudato Si as an inspiration for the Paris Agreement, from countries that you would not expect to pay much attention to what a pope was saying. But I think this was very, very important, and I don't know, we don't know the counterfactual, but I think you could say that Laudato Si was a major impetus into getting us this Paris Climate Agreement, and we know it's a very, very high priority for Pope Francis today. So, where do we go? Let me just, in the last few minutes, I'll just talk about where do we go, what do we need to do? Pope Francis talks, in his last 2 chapters are very interesting. I think chapter 1, 2, 3, I think it's chapter 5 is the kind of the institutional stuff. What we need to do on politics, on the international side, the dialogue between business and science and the economy, all that stuff. And then chapter 6 is more of a personal conversion side, which I think is very interesting because he puts the two of them together and basically says you can't have one without the other. On one hand, he said, the problems we have really go back to these misguided mindsets and flawed values and corrupted norms, the kind of things we talked about that drive the culture of individualism, libertarianism, and the technocratic paradigm. He said, we need transformative change. He says, I'm going to quote, he says, many things have to change, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, our mutual belonging, and a future to be shared with everyone. This basic awareness will enable the development of new convictions, attitudes, and forms of life. So, and again, it's very much a virtue ethics-based response. He's asking, and he actually says this virtue can be infectious. Good habits of one person can encourage good habits in others and improve and change social norms all around. He says, it calls forth a goodness which, albeit unseen, inevitably tends to spread. So hence he emphasizes ecological citizenship and ecological education. Nothing we do is too small. Even a simple act of recycling, it's not going to change the world, but it will help inculcate good habits. I remember when I was a child in Ireland, when we were eating candy bars and things, we'd throw them away on the street when we were finished with them because we just didn't think about it. But that's inconceivable today. It's because, and this is how virtue gets embedded, right? It becomes second nature. Nobody throws things on the street anymore and just think about it. But it's the same with this. If we think about if we want to solve climate change, it's going to involve a lot of changing habits. And that's, in terms of how we use energy. And they're not fully embedded yet, but they can get there. We can do it. But, here's a big but. Now, self-improvement and individual action on their own are not enough. To quote Pope Francis again, self-improvement on the part of individuals will not by itself remedy the extremely complex situation facing our world today. We also need institutional conversion. And I would argue that this is where sustainable development, it needs financial capacity, it needs technical capacity, but probably most important of all, it needs moral capacity. Right? We need to have the proper moral and ethical basis for the changes in our global economy that we need. We have the technology, we have the money. And by the way, we do have the money. It's not that, there's a huge ethical misallocation of resources in the world today, but we do have the money. For example, there are 6 million children die every day before age 5. 6 million. Almost every one of them due to things that could be easily cured by simple vaccinations, simple, interventions for malaria. Almost every one. That would cost probably $20 billion a year, which is a drop in the bucket. But we choose not to do that. That is a choice. And we are accountable for that choice. This is why this economy is not, right now, it's just not bounded by morality. It's not bounded by ethics. It's bounded by just making money and greed. But it doesn't have to be that way. Right? This is why Catholic social teaching is so important. So I think the problems, with Pope Francis, the impediments, I think, come from a narrow horizon. Short-termism. Let me make money today. Climate change, 30 years, 50 years? Oh, I can't think about that. That's too far away. So there's a narrow horizon, a narrow focus. Again, making profits, economic growth over longer-term issues of sustainability, and narrow interests. There's really too many vested interests that really control the debate today. And Pope Francis, by the way, this might be a little controversial, but I'm quoting Pope Francis. He's very blunt about this. He says, there are too many special interests and economic interests easily end up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected. He says, many of those who possess the most resources or economic and political power seem mostly concerned with masking the problems and concealing the symptoms. We all know there are people who are funding climate change denial all over the world to make money. And this is shameful, and this is something I think that we, as Catholics or as moral agents, we need to call out, because this is such a deeply pressing moral issue. Global problems require global solutions. Pope Francis says he calls one world with a common plan, right? One world with a common plan. The climate does not respect borders. You can't build a wall to keep out climate change, right? So everybody needs to work together on this, especially the countries that are most responsible for the carbon emissions that are out there. By the way, the bottom 3 billion people in the world today, the poorest 3 billion people, account for 5% of the carbon emissions, cumulative carbon emissions, right? Yet they are the ones on the front lines of climate change, with the droughts, with the floods, with the massive changes in just look what's going on in the Sahel region. Look what's going on in East Africa and various parts of the Middle East. They are paying the price for our lifestyles, all of us. Let me be very blunt about that. That's why this is very, very, very important. So this is what we need to do. And Pope Francis talks about use of the term ecological debt. Rich countries owe an ecological debt to poor countries. And as economists, we always say you should pay your debts. Some debts are not financial, but they're debts nonetheless. And of course, we all have roles to play. I don't have time to go into it in too much detail. Mike Norton there is a much bigger expert at this than I am. But the role of business, sustainable development agenda is not just a government agenda. It's for all of us, including business. And business can contribute, according to Pope Francis, through the creation of good jobs and by not polluting. He basically says economic activity is only ethical when the costs of using shared environmental resources are fully borne by those who incur them, not passed on to others or future generations. Now I ask everybody this, if that's the criterion for whether business is ethical or not, how many businesses today are actually run in an ethical manner? I don't want to answer that, but it's a question to pose. And also he says, but that's the negative side. There's also a positive side. We need business to apply its creativity and ingenuity and knowledge to create these sustainable development solutions. To actually not just worry about the financial bottom line, but also think about its social and environmental responsibilities. I know there are people in this room who take that very, very seriously. There's also a role for Francis also says there's a role for civil society that can draw public attention to these issues and employ legitimate means of pressure. And he also says There's a role for consumers. You should boycott businesses that don't behave themselves. If you boycott them, you force them to consider their environmental footprint and their patterns of production. And I think there's a lot of work going on. Big issue now with the fossil fuel divestment movement. A lot of very big institutional investors and pension funds are saying we are no longer investing in fossil fuels. This is a consumer boycott, and it's very, and I think it gets endorsed by Laudato Si. So, to conclude, I ran a little over, but I think I'm okay. Pope Francis is basically calling for a cultural revolution, not in the sense of Mao Zedong, but in the sense of, I would say, Thomas Aquinas, Pope Leo, and of course the Gospels, to realign economic progress with moral progress, and move to the kind of global economy that benefits us all. We don't need to burn it all down. That's not the revolution we want. It's simply about building a moral barrier around the global economy today and re-centering it on the common good, so that we can, to quote Pope Francis, replace this globalization of indifference with a globalization of hope. And I'll end with that. Thank you very much.